The city of Chicago was always bustling, but the outskirts where I worked was another story. It was late at night, quiet, with nothing but the hum of distant traffic. I was working the graveyard shift in a large, isolated warehouse on the edge of town. By day, the warehouse was full of activity. Stacked metal containers, wooden crates, and heavy machinery. But by night, it felt like a different world. The dim overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows in the corners of the vast, empty space. It was quiet, eerily quiet, and it gave me time to think. I never minded the solitude. I was a simple man, just trying to make a living. I took this night shift to earn some extra cash while trying to find something more stable. I had a business degree, but work wasn't coming easily. I often stayed late, doing what I could to make the most of my time. I was quiet, observant, and not easily intimidated by the dark, isolated setting of the warehouse. It was routine, until one night when things changed. It was past midnight when I heard it. The footsteps. I had just finished loading a shipment when I first noticed them. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the otherwise empty warehouse. Before I could turn, a shadowy figure lunged from behind a stack of crates. The cold steel of a knife sliced across my arm. A heavy iron rod slammed against my ribs, and I collapsed onto the cold, concrete floor, gasping for breath. Pain radiated through my body as I struggled to stay conscious. I was confused, disoriented, unable to understand why I was being attacked. The figure loomed over me, ready to strike again. Instinct kicked in. I kicked back, knocking the attacker off balance. I scrambled to my feet, blood dripping from my arm as I ran between the crates and metal racks, the attacker chasing close behind. I saw the security light ahead. With one last burst of energy, I sprinted toward it, bursting through the warehouse doors and collapsing outside. My heart was racing, my breaths shallow. By the time help arrived, the attacker was long gone. The police arrived shortly after I made the call. I was shaken, but I gave them everything I could remember. The problem? I never saw the attacker's face. It all happened too fast. As they investigated the scene, they found a disturbing fact. Months earlier, I had gotten into a physical altercation with a coworker named Jason Carter. The fight was heated, with punches thrown, broken equipment, and a lot of shouting. Jason had been upset, but he was the one who quit his job soon after the incident and disappeared. No one ever saw him again. The question loomed. Had Jason come back for revenge? The investigation stalled as the police looked into Jason's disappearance. But just when we thought we had a lead, things took another dark turn. A week later, another worker disappeared. His name was Ethan Lewis, and he was last seen working late, just like I had been. The warehouse was nearly empty when he was last seen. His locker was left untouched, his belongings still inside. No one knew where he had gone. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. But then, a chilling clue turned up. A work shirt, stained with blood, was discovered behind a stack of crates. The fear in the warehouse grew exponentially. No one was sure what was happening, but people were starting to panic. Many workers started refusing to stay late, fearing they would be next. Everyone suspected Jason, especially since his disappearance had seemed so suspicious. But when the police tracked him down, they found an alibi. He had been in another state when the attack and disappearance happened. If it wasn't Jason, then who was behind these attacks? My best friend, Kevin Moore, also worked at the warehouse. He was a good guy, and he didn't buy into the idea that Jason was responsible. He was certain that someone inside the warehouse had to be involved. "We need to check the security footage," Kevin insisted one night. I didn't want to believe it, but when we reviewed the footage from the nights of the attack and Ethan's disappearance, we found something terrifying. The cameras had malfunctioned both times. They had been disabled. Someone inside the warehouse had sabotaged them. It was clear now. Someone who worked with us, someone we knew, was orchestrating this horror. But who? A few nights later, Kevin convinced me to stay late again. He was determined to get to the bottom of this. So, we hid behind crates, waiting in silence, watching every corner of the dark warehouse. At exactly 1:30 a.m., we heard footsteps. A shadow moved in the dim light. It was one of our own coworkers, Brian Turner. He was a quiet man, always watching but never speaking. He kept to himself, blending into the background, and no one ever suspected him. Kevin and I exchanged glances. This was it. We had to confront him. Suddenly, Brian grabbed a metal pipe and charged at me. The adrenaline coursed through me, and I dodged, throwing myself at him. I tackled him to the ground, holding him down, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. Kevin called the police immediately. It didn't take long before they arrived, and Brian was arrested. The truth came out in the hours that followed. Brian Turner had been behind it all. He had an obsession with control, and he didn't like me questioning things at the warehouse. He attacked me that night to scare me off. But when Ethan saw Brian tampering with the cameras, he had to be silenced. Brian kidnapped Ethan, keeping him locked up in his house until the police came for him. When they searched Brian's house, they found Ethan, alive, though deeply traumatized, tied up in the basement. Brian was arrested, and Ethan was taken to the hospital. He survived, but the scars of the ordeal would remain forever. As for me, I quit the job. I couldn't stay in that warehouse anymore. I knew one thing for sure. Some jobs are just not worth the risk. I moved to this city a few months ago, hoping to turn things around. It wasn't easy. Despite my business degree, finding a good, stable job had proven to be more difficult than I expected. After months of searching, I finally took a temporary night shift at a local grocery store, just to make ends meet. I spent my free time reading novels and fishing, anything to keep my mind off the job search that never seemed to end. I've always been observant, noticing the small things that most people miss. That sharpness, while not always appreciated, kept me out of trouble and helped me see things that would soon change everything. The grocery store was busy during the day, people rushing in and out, grabbing what they needed, and getting back to their hectic lives. But at night, it was a different world. The bright fluorescent lights flickered above, and the constant hum of the coolers was the only sound. By midnight, the aisles were empty, and the quiet felt almost oppressive. It was during these long hours that I started to notice something strange about one of my coworkers. His name was Colin Maddox, and he had been working at the store for a while before I came along. He was in his late 30s, lean but always looking tired, almost like he hadn't slept in days. His dark hoodie was always the same, no matter the temperature inside. I never saw him without it, even when the store felt like a sauna in the summer. At first, Colin seemed like a typical coworker, quiet, keeping to himself. But then I started noticing strange things. There were two men who visited the store almost every night. They didn't buy anything, just wandered the aisles, speaking in hushed tones. They always seemed to approach Colin, and the moment they did, his demeanor would shift. Where he normally moved lazily, almost disinterested, he suddenly became alert, attentive. His entire focus on these two men. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, curiosity got the better of me. As Colin was stocking shelves, I couldn't help myself. Why do these guys always come to you? They barely buy anything, I asked, trying to sound casual. He stopped what he was doing and glared at me with a look that sent a chill down my spine. Mind your own business. You're new here. Don't try to act smart. I blinked, taken aback. I hadn't expected such a cold response, but I didn't let it go. A few nights later, I asked again, my suspicion growing. It's weird, man. They don't ask me anything. Just you. Why? This time, his face darkened. His voice dropped to a whisper. but the anger in it was unmistakable. "You're lucky to even have this job. If you don't shut up, I'll make sure the manager fires you." I was stunned. It was just a simple question, yet Colin's response had me feeling uneasy. Why would he get so defensive over something so trivial? I didn't have time to dwell on it, though. A few nights later, everything changed. It was past midnight when the nightmare began. I was working the register when the door swung open and two masked men stormed in, guns drawn. They screamed at everyone to get on the ground. The cashier, a young woman, froze, her hands shaking as she dropped to the floor. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but I stayed still, not knowing what else to do. Colin, however, stood there, motionless for a few moments. Then, suddenly, he lunged. He grabbed one of the robbers, trying to wrestle the gun from his hand. The other robber swung his pistol, hitting Colin hard across the face. I heard the sickening thud of the blow as Colin collapsed, unconscious. The robbers wasted no time. They emptied the cash register and ran out of the store, leaving chaos in their wake. I didn't move at first, too stunned by the violence. When the store was finally silent, I rushed to Colin's side, my hands shaking as I checked for a pulse. He was alive, barely, but something felt off. The whole situation felt wrong. The next morning, Colin didn't show up for work. His phone was off. I went to his apartment, but it was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, just nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I spoke to the store manager, telling him about the two men who always visited Colin and how his behavior changed when they were around. The police were called, and they started investigating. What they found shocked everyone. Colin never lived at the address he provided. His employment records were fake, and when they dug deeper, they discovered something chilling. Colin Maddox wasn't even his real name. It was as if he had never existed at all. The mystery deepened. Who was he really? What was his connection to the robbers? And why did he act the way he did? Weeks went by and I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. The whole thing haunted me. One night, my girlfriend, Maya Jensen, and I went out for dinner at a restaurant on the outskirts of the city. As we waited for our food, I froze mid-conversation. There, behind the counter, I saw him. It was Colin. Same face, same eyes, same strange, unkempt appearance. But he wasn't a grocery store worker anymore. He was wearing a waiter's uniform. "Maya, that's him," I whispered urgently. She turned and looked, her face paling. We didn't say another word. We got up and rushed out of the restaurant, my heart racing. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a coincidence. I called the police immediately. Within hours, they raided the restaurant and arrested Colin. And then the truth finally came out. Colin hadn't been just a grocery store worker. He was an informant for a criminal group. The two men who visited the store were his contacts. The robbery had been staged, part of a plan gone wrong. When it all fell apart, Colin had run, changing his identity and starting over. But it was my observation, my attention to detail, that led to his downfall. I had noticed the smallest of things no one else had cared about, and that had made all the difference.